These are sounds of the city. They are sounds that John Adams knows well because he lives in the city. John is 7 years old. He lives with his mother and father and little brother in an apartment on the second floor of a large building. He likes his home in the large building on the second floor. He has many friends nearby. Some of his friends live in his building, some live in houses, some live in other apartment buildings, and some live in townhouses. He often plays with his friends along the sidewalk on Blossom Street, where he lives. John knows many people who do things for the people who live on Blossom Street. He knows the mailman. His name is Mr. Hale. He knows the garbage man who comes in a huge truck twice each week to collect the garbage. He knows Mr. Bean, who delivers groceries from a large supermarket in a shopping center. But best of all, he knows Mr. Blake, the milkman. Mr. Blake always comes all the way up to where John lives. He comes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning. On Monday, he leaves 1 gallon of milk and a pint of cream. And on Wednesday, he leaves a half-gallon of milk, a pound of butter, and a carton of cottage cheese. On Friday, he leaves 2 gallons of milk. When the back door of the apartment is open, Mr. Blake always says, "Good morning, how are you today?" Mr. Blake is a very friendly man. One day, John said to Mr. Blake, "Mr. Blake, where do you get all the things you bring to us?" Mr. Blake answered, "From the dairy, John. I get all the things I deliver at the dairy. The dairy is about 10 miles from here. It's at the very edge of our city." "Milk comes from cows in the farm," said John. "How does it get to the dairy?" Mrs. Adams heard John talking to Mr. Blake. She went to the door and said, "Come in, Mr. Blake, if you have time, and tell us about what happens to milk in the dairy." Mr. Blake came into the kitchen. He began to talk with John. "John, milk comes from the country to the dairy in special trucks. Milk is hauled in large cylinder-shaped tanks fastened on the trucks. The tanks are much like big vacuum bottles. They keep the milk cool and clean." "I know about vacuum bottles," said John. "I know how they keep milk cool when we go on a picnic." "Yes," said Mr. Blake. "Now let me tell you about what happens to the milk after the tank trucks bring it to the dairy. The milk is piped into larger holding tanks inside the dairy. Then workers take samples of milk from the big holding tank to test. They want to know the temperature of the milk, how clean it is, and how much milk fat it has in it." "I know what milk fat is," said John. "It's the part of the milk that makes butter." "You're right," said Mr. Blake, "and it's the part of the milk that rises to the top as cream. But now, let me tell you what happens after the milk is tested. After the milk is tested, it's pasteurized. Do you know what pasteurized means?" John did not know. "When milk is pasteurized," said Mr. Blake, "it's heated, but not boiled. It's heated to a temperature that makes it pure for you and me to drink. It's heated to the proper temperature, and then it's cooled again very quickly." "Well, then it's almost ready for us to drink," said John. "You're right," said Mr. Blake, "but before it's put into the bottles, something else is done to most of the milk people drink. It's homogenized." John did not know what homogenized meant, so Mr. Blake told him. "When milk is homogenized, it's placed in a machine that forces it through little holes. When the milk is pushed through the very little holes, the milk fat particles in the milk are broken into tiny pieces and stay mixed throughout the milk. The tiny milk fat particles will not rise to the top of the milk as cream. Most people like homogenized milk. They like the cream mixed through the milk rather than on the top. The milk I leave for you is homogenized. And I like it, said John. I like homogenized milk. What happens next, Mr. Blake? Next, a machine called a bottling machine puts the milk into cartons or bottles. The machine fills each carton or bottle and seals it so it will remain clean and pure. Then the bottles or cartons of milk go on the conveyor to a refrigerated room where they stay until milkmen come to get them. John spoke up quickly. I know the rest of the story about milk. The milkmen load the milk in their trucks and take it to places where people live. Some of the milkmen deliver milk to homes like I do, said Mr. Blake, but some deliver to other places. Some take milk to stores, some to hospitals, some to schools, some to restaurants. And you must remember that milkmen also deliver other dairy foods such as butter, cream, and cottage cheese. All these things are made from milk. I wish I had time to tell you about how they're made, but I must get on my way now, John. Mr. Blake rose from his chair and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Adams." "Thank you for telling me about milk and the dairy," said John. Mrs. Adams, John, and Mr. Blake all said goodbye. Mr. Blake hurried down the stairs to his milk truck. John was happy that Mr. Blake came in to talk with him. Someday, he thought, I'll find out how butter, cottage cheese, and ice cream are made. Someday, I'll visit the plants where they're made.